In 1892, in a remote valley of the western United States, forestry researchers documented a fossilized tree base, more than 8 meters in diameter, buried beneath layers of sedimentary rock. What remained was not a fallen trunk, but the imprint of a living organism that once stood on the landscape, its height and mass far exceeding any tree species alive today. Comparable findings have since been identified in Europe, South America, and Australia, embedded in geological layers dated to tens of millions of years ago. Together, they suggest a world that is both familiar and unsettling. A planet once dominated by forests, where individual trees rivaled small buildings in scale. By conventional reasoning, organisms of such size and abundance should have profoundly shaped Earth's climate, ecosystems, and evolutionary pathways. Their presence would have altered atmospheric composition, soil systems, and the structure of life itself. Natural history, as we know it, should revolve around them, and yet it does not. In textbooks and public narratives, these colossal forests appear only briefly, relegated to footnotes of deep time, mentioned without emphasis or consequence. So what became of these giant trees? And why does such a significant chapter of Earth's biological past seem to have faded almost entirely from our collective understanding? According to the established scientific narrative, Earth's forests have not followed a path of disappearance, but of gradual transformation. Paleobotany describes an evolutionary progression shaped by climate shifts, atmospheric change, and biological competition. Trees, in this view, reached varying sizes depending on available carbon dioxide, temperature, precipitation, and soil conditions. When those variables changed, forest structure changed with them. During parts of the Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras, higher atmospheric oxygen and carbon dioxide levels are believed to have supported faster growth and larger plant forms. Over time, tectonic drift altered ocean currents, global temperatures declined, and atmospheric composition stabilized closer to modern levels. Forests adapted. Large species gave way to smaller, more efficient forms, better suited to cooler, drier, and more seasonal environments. From this perspective, fossilized giant stumps and massive petrified logs are not evidence of a lost world, but natural outcomes of ancient ecological conditions. They represent local extremes rather than a global norm. Their apparent absence in the modern era is explained by constraints: gravity, water transport limits, wind stress, and diminishing returns in height and mass. Modern trees, the argument goes, already approach the upper boundary of biological feasibility. In this framework, there is no mystery to resolve. The past was different, the environment changed, and life responded accordingly. What we see today is not a diminished version of Earth's forests, but an optimized one, shaped by millions of years of selective pressure and physical limits. This is the version of events most of us are taught. Yet when these fossil remains are examined more closely, certain details begin to strain the simplicity of that narrative. Some of the largest stumps are found not in isolated pockets, but aligned across wide geographic regions, embedded in sediment layers that suggest rapid burial rather than slow forest turnover. In several sites, the surrounding soils show little evidence of the deep, complex root systems modern trees require to support comparable mass. The scale is familiar, but the context is not. Equally notable is how often these findings sit at the margins of mainstream discussion. They are cataloged, dated, and measured, yet rarely integrated into broader models of forest ecology or planetary history. In some cases, the remains are described as unusual growth forms or localized anomalies, even when similar structures appear thousands of kilometers apart. The data exists. What is less clear is how it fits. There are also biological questions that remain unresolved. Growth rings in certain petrified specimens suggest rates of expansion, that exceed those observed in modern trees, even under optimal conditions. Some trunks display uniform density at scales that would challenge known limits of water transport and structural support. These observations have been published, debated, and, more often than not, set aside without definitive resolution. None of this constitutes proof of an alternative history, but it does introduce friction. If these were not isolated exceptions, if they were once part of a broader and stable system, then their disappearance represents more than routine adaptation. And that raises a central question that lingers beneath the data. If evidence of forests, unlike anything on Earth today, has been repeatedly recorded, why does it remain so peripheral to the official story of our planet's past? From the standpoint of conventional science, the physical limits of trees are well defined. Height and mass are constrained by gravity, material strength, and the ability to transport water from roots to leaves. Modern redwoods and sequoias are often cited as examples of organisms approaching these limits. Their maximum size is explained through a balance of capillary action, transpiration, and structural reinforcement. Within this framework, trees significantly larger than those alive today should be biologically inefficient or mechanically unstable. However, fossilized remains complicate this picture. In multiple locations, petrified trunks and stump bases display diameters far exceeding those of modern giant trees, yet lack the tapering and reinforcement patterns expected if they were merely scaled-up versions of existing species. In some specimens, internal structures appear relatively uniform across large cross-sections, suggesting growth under conditions that reduced mechanical stress. This does not overturn known physics, but it does imply environmental variables that differ markedly from those assumed in current models. Another accepted explanation holds that these remains represent rare local conditions, perhaps floodplains or volcanic regions where nutrients and water were unusually abundant. In such scenarios, trees might temporarily exceed normal size before collapsing or being replaced. Yet this interpretation becomes less persuasive when similar fossils are found across continents, embedded in strata of comparable age. The geographic distribution suggests repetition, not exception. If these were isolated ecological accidents, their recurrence on a planetary scale becomes difficult to explain without invoking broader systemic factors. Mainstream paleobotany also assumes that ancient soils were capable of supporting these organisms through deep and extensive root networks. Modern trees of great height rely on complex underground systems to anchor themselves and regulate nutrient flow. Yet at several fossil sites, the surrounding sediment lacks evidence of prolonged soil development. Instead, stumps appear rooted in relatively shallow or rapidly deposited layers. This has led to the proposal that the visible bases represent only the lowest preserved sections of much deeper systems. While possible, this remains an assumption rather than a confirmed observation. Growth rate analysis introduces a further tension. Tree rings in fossilized wood are often used to infer age and environmental conditions. In certain giant specimens, ring spacing suggests periods of accelerated growth, sustained over decades or centuries. Under modern atmospheric conditions, such rates would likely result in weaker wood and increased vulnerability to collapse. Yet these trees persisted long enough to reach extraordinary size. This raises the question of whether ancient atmospheric composition, pressure, or gravity differed subtly enough to alter the biological cost of rapid expansion. Official models point to higher carbon dioxide and oxygen levels as partial explanations. Elevated CO2 can enhance photosynthesis, while higher oxygen supports greater metabolic activity. These factors are well documented in Earth's deep past. Still, simulations based on these variables alone struggle to account for the upper extremes implied by the fossil record. Even generous estimates fall short of explaining trunks with diameters measured in multiple meters, without invoking additional stabilizing conditions. One such condition occasionally discussed in technical literature is environmental uniformity. Modern forests are shaped by wind stress, seasonal drought, temperature fluctuation, and biological disturbance. If ancient climates were more stable, with lower wind shear and fewer extreme events, trees might invest less in structural defense and more in vertical and radial growth. Some sedimentary records do point to long periods of climatic equilibrium. The challenge lies in determining whether such stability was local, regional, or global. There is also the matter of burial and preservation. Conventional explanations describe petrified forests as the result of volcanic eruptions, floods, or landslides that rapidly entombed living trees. This process is well understood. Yet in certain sites, the number of preserved stumps and their upright orientation suggest not a single catastrophic event, but repeated episodes affecting mature forests. This implies a recurring mechanism capable of erasing entire ecosystems while leaving their basic geometry intact. Such a mechanism is not clearly identified in standard narratives. Biological competition offers another explanation. As flowering plants diversified and animals evolved new feeding strategies, selective pressure favored faster reproduction and adaptability over sheer size. Large trees, slow to mature, may have been outcompeted. While plausible, this argument addresses long-term trends rather than abrupt absence. Competition explains why new giants did not emerge, but not why existing ones disappeared so thoroughly from the fossil to modern transition. Taken individually, none of these discrepancies overturns the established understanding of forest evolution. Each has a reasonable counterargument, and many remain active areas of research rather than settled conclusions. But when considered together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Repeated global distribution, unusual structural features, unexpected growth indicators, and incomplete environmental explanations point to gaps rather than contradictions. The official narrative accounts for change, adaptation, and constraint. What it does not fully explain is scale, specifically, why the upper boundary of tree size appears to have shifted so dramatically and so permanently. If Earth once supported forests that operated near a different set of biological and physical limits, then their disappearance was not merely a matter of gradual optimization. It was a transition, and transitions of that magnitude rarely occur without underlying causes that extend beyond any single variable we currently measure. When the individual lines of evidence are viewed together, a broader pattern begins to emerge. The recurring scale of these trees, their widespread distribution, and the consistency of their preservation suggest that they were not products of rare circumstances, but components of a larger, coherent system. This was not an ecosystem pushed occasionally beyond its limits, but one operating under a different baseline of constraints and possibilities. In such a system, tree size would not be an anomaly, but a natural outcome. Atmospheric composition, climate stability, soil formation, and biological competition would have interacted in ways that reinforced one another. Faster growth would not weaken structure if mechanical stress was reduced. Shallow rooting would not imply instability if environmental forces were more uniform. What appear today as biological improbabilities may once have been ecological norms. This perspective shifts the question away from individual species and toward planetary conditions. Rather than asking why certain trees grew so large, it asks why Earth no longer permits such growth. The disappearance of giant trees in this light reflects a systemic change, one that altered the operating parameters of life itself. Forests did not simply shrink. The environment that enabled extreme scale ceased to exist. The implications extend beyond botany. Forests regulate climate, influence atmospheric chemistry, and shape entire food webs. A world capable of sustaining trees of this magnitude would have functioned differently at every level, from carbon cycling to evolutionary pressure. If that world ended, its loss would mark a turning point not only in forest history, but in the trajectory of life on Earth. What remains uncertain is how sudden this shift was and whether it occurred once or multiple times. Faced with these uncertainties, some researchers have explored possibilities that remain deliberately hypothetical. One proposal suggests that ancient atmospheric pressure may have been higher than it is today. Increased pressure would improve gas exchange within plant tissues and reduce the energetic cost of moving water vertically, subtly relaxing constraints that now limit height and mass. This idea is difficult to test directly, but it aligns with certain geological indicators that point to denser ancient atmospheres. Others have proposed that gravity itself, while constant on geological timescales, may have interacted differently with biological systems under alternative environmental conditions. In a world with lower wind shear and fewer extreme disturbances, the effective mechanical stress experienced by tall organisms would be reduced. Under such circumstances, trees could grow larger without proportionally increasing structural reinforcement. There are also hypotheses centered on biology rather than physics. Some researchers suggest that ancient trees may have possessed vascular systems, unlike those of modern species, allowing more efficient internal transport. These systems would not require fundamentally new laws of biology, only variations that were later lost through extinction. Fossilization rarely preserves soft tissue in sufficient detail to confirm or dismiss this possibility. Another line of reasoning considers time itself as a variable. If climatic stability persisted for millions of years without major interruption, organisms could afford to grow slowly, but continuously, accumulating mass over centuries in ways that modern, disturbance-driven ecosystems do not allow. None of these ideas claim certainty. They exist as controlled extensions of current knowledge, framed by what is plausible rather than what is proven. Together, they serve not as answers, but as reminders that the limits we observe today may not represent the limits that once governed life on this planet. Beyond measurements and models lies a more elusive dimension of the problem. Human understanding of the past is shaped not only by evidence, but by expectation. We tend to imagine history as a steady refinement, a movement from primitive toward optimized. In that framework, loss feels uncomfortable. The idea that the Earth once supported forms of life larger, more imposing, and perhaps more stable than those we know today runs against a deeply held assumption of progress. Across cultures, ancient myths speak of an earlier world defined by enormity, trees that reach the heavens, forests described as eternal, unchanging, and sacred. Such stories are usually interpreted as metaphor or exaggeration, expressions of awe rather than memory. Yet myths often persist where precise knowledge has faded, preserving emotional truths long after factual context is lost. They reflect not data, but intuition. There is also a psychological dimension to absence. When something disappears completely, leaving only fragmented traces, it becomes easier to minimize its significance. Giant trees no longer shape our landscapes or our daily experience. They survive only as stone, buried and silent. Without living counterparts, they feel abstract, detached from reality, and therefore easier to overlook. At a deeper level, the reluctance to engage with these questions may stem from vulnerability. If Earth has hosted worlds fundamentally different from our own, then stability is not guaranteed. The present becomes a temporary state rather than a culmination. In that realization lies both humility and unease. What we choose to remember and what we allow to fade often reveals as much about ourselves as it does about the past. Today, the largest trees on Earth stand as monuments to endurance. They are protected, measured, and celebrated as the upper limits of what nature can achieve. Yet, when set against the fossil record, they may represent not a peak, but a remnant, a surviving expression of a system that once operated under different rules, in a world that no longer exists. The disappearance of giant trees does not come with a clear ending. There is no single catastrophe to point to, no definitive line in time where forests crossed an irreversible threshold. Instead, the evidence suggests a gradual narrowing of possibility, a quiet closing of environmental conditions that once allowed extreme scale to persist. What vanished was not just size, but a way of functioning. Whether such forests could ever return remains uncertain. Some changes to Earth's climate and atmosphere are cyclical, others are not. Evolution does not preserve options. It selects what works in the present. What thrived under ancient conditions may no longer be viable, even if fragments of its blueprint remain encoded in life today. In this sense, the giant trees serve as more than biological curiosities. They are signals from a deeper past, reminders that history is not a straight line of improvement, but a series of expansions and contractions. Civilizations rise and fall. Ecosystems do the same. And the more closely we examine what has been lost, the more clearly we are forced to confront a simple, unsettling possibility. Earth has already hosted worlds we no longer fully understand.